The concept of war and alliance is also brought to question in Orwell's book 1984. In the book, all the superstates that were left over from the Third World War are now fighting over disputed land in North Africa, Hong Kong, and Antarctica. In the earlier days of these conflicts, Oceania and East Asia fought against Eurasia and North Africa, but out of nowhere, Oceania ditches East Asia and allies with Eurasia. Now Eurasia and Oceania are fighting against East Asia over the North African territory. After this alliance, people began tearing down posters about the old alliance. Soon after, Oceania's government claimed to have conquered all of Africa. This concept seems ridiculous, but has actually happened a lot in the real world. In Iraq, the United States considered Saddam Hussein as their ally against Iran. But after Iraq lost the war, the United States pulled a complete 180 and called Saddam a war criminal. Not just that, but the US government also made up the lie that Iraq had nuclear weapons and could be used against the United States at any time. This lie was then used to justify invading the country. Throughout this, Iran was still an enemy of the United States, but because Iraq was losing, the US had to save face by betraying an ally by once providing military equipment to Iraq against Iran to invading Iraq itself. And this did kind of work. While the war itself is disapproved of by most people, a lot of people see the war as removing Saddam Hussein and saving Iraq from one of the most evil dictators in the world at the time. But in reality, the war was always about continuing to spread American influence around the world even after the Cold War. And to the US government, it didn't matter who the allies or enemies were, as long as the influence could spread. That's all that mattered. The same can be said about the Soviet Union. During World War I, we were allies with the Russian Empire. This alliance was crucial for having a leg up over Germany and Austria. But the Russian Empire ended up having to pull out of the war because the communist militia known as the Bolsheviks were revolting. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists won and formed the USSR, or the United Soviet Socialist States, but most people ended up calling it the Soviet Union. Similar to how the United States is really called the United States of America, but most people just call it the US or America. After this, the Soviet Union was now considered an enemy by the public. This would make sense though, since this is a completely new government with an opposite and very radical views rather than the public turning on the same government with the same ideologies. On the other hand, the United States government had mixed opinions because they didn't agree with a communist dictatorship, but they also wanted to continue their isolationist policy. Then World War II happened. During World War II, the United Kingdom and France allied with the Soviet Union against Germany, Italy, and Japan. After Pearl Harbor, the United States joined the UK, French, and Soviet alliance against the Axis powers. While the public stayed skeptical of the Soviet Union, they were now considered an ally of the United States. But that all changed almost directly after the war. The Soviet Union and the United States were left as the two superpowers of the world. It was perfect enough to where both superpowers had the exact opposite opinions on how the world should operate post-World War II. These then allies were now enemies and began to take advantage of the weakened Europe. Both superpowers began funding reconstruction efforts in the east and west side of Europe. With reconstruction also came the formatting of government. With this government reformatting, a lot of nations received American aid, adopted liberal ideas and governments, while the countries receiving Soviet aid adopted communist and authoritarian ideas and governments. As both superpowers felt threatened about the expansion of power by the other, they began forming military pacts in Europe. The United States united anti-Soviet Western countries under NATO, and the Soviet Union united anti-Western communist states under the Warsaw Pact. Once enemies, now the US and USSR had turned not just themselves, but the west and east of Europe against each other. In 1991, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, as well as the Warsaw Pact, completely collapsed. After this, Russia ended up adopting Western practices such as democracy and mixed market economy. With this radical shift towards Western ideologies, the West wasn't allies with Russia yet, but were becoming very friendly. The reason why Western countries hesitated to become allies with the new Russia is because a large majority of Russia's citizens wanted the Soviet Union to be revived, but ended up voting for nationalist parties rather than the Communist Party because communism had literally just failed in the nation. As the relationship between Russia and the West was growing, Vladimir Putin, the technically president but really dictator, began to shift the culture of Russia back into its anti-Western days. He did this by trying to invest in wars in the Middle East, invaded the country Georgia, and invaded Ukraine in 2014 and again on a larger scale in 2022, all while crying that the West had pushed him to start these wars by expanding NATO. Russia also started to distance itself from the West and began starting friendly relationships with Iran, Communist China, and North Korea. A nation that was seen to be friendly with the West was now considered an enemy to the world. An interesting part of history to look at is the relationship between the United States and Mexico. The US and Mexico were bitter enemies and actually ended up going to war with each other in 1846 because they couldn't agree on who had power over Texas. Now come all the way to today, the United States boasts about how well of a trade partner Mexico is, while also comparing about how they're stealing all of our manufacturing jobs and won't do anything about immigration and drug trafficking. One day Mexico's our friend, the next day they're our enemy. I think the issue is that the government can't understand we are allies with the Mexican government and enemies with the cartels. Most immigrants from the south of the border come from Asia, not Mexico. And with drug trafficking, most drugs come from South America rather than just Mexico. All of this is then promoted and run by the cartels in northern Mexico. As a short cameo, Italy during World War II can also be used as an example, but not with the extent of there being the same government in power. During World War II, Italy was allied with the Axis powers, but when the Allies invaded Italy from the south, the public in Italy noticed that they were going to lose the war. As a reaction to this, the citizens captured and publicly executed their dictator, Benito Mussolini. After this, the Italian government ditched Germany and Japan and allied with the Western Alliance. And to continue the internet saga, events like these didn't really happen on the internet due to web browsers and social media being run by companies and not global powers. But something that has changed from the earlier internet days was the restrictions of what can and cannot be posted online. This became a big shift from the internet being known as the place where you can escape speech restrictions in certain nations. In some instances, the banning of certain phrases and words is a lot more harsh online than it is in actual law in most countries. As a lot of these events happened before 1984 was written, it's very interesting to see how much of this alliance flip-flopping we see today, almost 60 to 70 years after the book was published.